I'll take her, and all 3 kids." The words didn't sound loud, but they carried, cutting through the dry West Texas air like something heavier than steel. And for a moment, even the wind seemed to hesitate. Dust hanging in the sunlight that slipped through the gaps of the wooden railings. Every face turning, every boot going still, and then the laughter came, low at first, then louder. Men leaning back against the corral fence, hats tipping, shoulders shaking as if they'd just heard the best joke in 3 counties. But Ethan Cole didn't laugh, didn't even blink. He just stood there on the edge of the yard, one hand resting near his belt, not on a gun, just resting, like a man who had already decided something long before anyone else noticed. And 30 feet ahead of him stood Clara Whitmore, dress faded, fabric pulled tight where life had asked too much of it. 3 children gathered close to her legs like small shadows trying to disappear into her. The youngest boy barefoot, toes pressed into the dirt as if he could sink into it and be gone. And no one was looking at her eyes. Not a single soul in that yard cared to meet them, because it was easier that way. Easier to laugh when you don't look at a person long enough to see they're still standing, still breathing, still carrying something no one else wanted to hold. Someone near the fence spat into the dust and said, "You hear that, boys? He's taking the whole bundle." And another voice followed, 3 kids included, no extra charge. And the laughter rose again, sharper now. But Ethan stepped forward, 1 boot at a time, gravel grinding under his weight, steady, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world. And when he reached them, he didn't look at the men, didn't look at the crowd. He crouched just enough to meet the smallest boy's eyes. And the kid didn't flinch. Not this time. Just stared back with something quiet. Something old for a child that size. And Ethan straightened, turning his head slightly, voice low. "They stay with her." And the yard shifted, not quiet this time, just different, like something unseen had moved through it. The kind of shift men don't name but feel in their bones. Clara's fingers tightened on her children, and for the first time she spoke, barely above the wind. "Why?" And Ethan paused, just long enough for the dust to settle again, for the sun to shift an inch across the boards, for every man there to lean in without knowing it. And then he answered, because no one else did. And that was it. No speech, no grand reason, just that. And somehow it landed heavier than anything shouted all morning. Someone scoffed, another muttered about trouble, about how long before he'd regret it, how long before he'd ride off and leave them behind like everyone else had done in one way or another. But Ethan didn't turn, didn't argue. He simply reached out, not grabbing, not pulling, just offering his hand to the smallest boy. And after a second that felt longer than it should have, the boy took it, small fingers wrapping around a hand built from rope, reins, and years under an open sky. And that was when the laughter stopped completely, not because anyone said it should, but because something about that moment didn't belong to them anymore, didn't need their approval. And as Ethan turned to lead them out of that yard, boots marking a quiet path through the dust, Clara followed, not behind him, not ahead, just beside, holding her children close, carrying nothing but what she already had. And somewhere in the back of the crowd, a man shook his head and said under his breath, "That cowboy just bought himself a lifetime of trouble." But he said it softer than before, like he wasn't entirely sure it was true, like maybe, just maybe, he'd just witnessed something he didn't understand yet. The road out of town stretched long and pale under the late afternoon sun, dust rising slow behind each step like the land itself was watching them leave. And no one spoke for the first mile, not Ethan, not Clara, not even the children, just the sound of boots and small feet pressing into dry earth, a rhythm that felt uncertain at first, like 4 strangers trying to walk in the same direction without knowing if they belonged together. And the boy's hand stayed in Ethan's, not tight, not loose, just there, as if testing whether it would still be there with the next step. And the girl, the oldest, kept glancing back toward town, not because she wanted to return, but because she had learned that what you leave behind sometimes follows. And the middle child carried nothing but a small piece of cloth tied around his wrist, frayed and faded, something that had survived longer than it should have. And ahead, Ethan's cabin sat quiet against the horizon. A low wooden structure with a leaning fence and a well that had seen better seasons. Nothing about it promised comfort, but nothing about it turned them away either. And when they reached the gate, Ethan paused, just a fraction, hand resting on the wood, as if measuring something invisible. Then he pushed it open, slow, the hinge giving a tired sound that broke the silence like a memory waking up, and Clara stepped in first, not waiting for an invitation, not asking permission, just walking into the space like someone who understood that doors were meant to be crossed, not admired. And inside, the cabin smelled of leather, dust, and something faintly like smoke from mornings long past. The children stood near the doorway at first, unsure if they should spread out or stay close. But Clara moved deeper, setting her hand on the table, testing its steadiness, glancing at the corners, the windows, the small shelf with 2 cups and a tin plate, reading the room the way others read faces. And Ethan set his hat down, not looking at her, not explaining anything, just giving the space time to breathe. And after a moment, Clara untied the cloth from her son's wrist, folded it carefully, and placed it on the table between them. "If you change your mind," she said, voice calm, steady, "we will not beg." And Ethan looked at the cloth, then at her, not long, just enough to understand the weight behind it. "You can keep it," he said. And that was all. No promise, no reassurance, just a line drawn quiet and firm. And outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the walls like it was trying to listen in, and somewhere far behind them, the town still watched, still waited, still counted days like coins. But inside that cabin, something else had started, something slower, quieter, harder to measure. The smallest boy let go of Ethan's hand at last, not because he was afraid, but because he no longer needed to hold on quite so tight. And the girl stepped toward the window, looking out not at where they had been, but at what stood ahead: empty land, open sky, a place where no one had yet decided what they were worth. And Clara stood in the center of the room, shoulders straight, not grateful, not broken, just present. And Ethan picked up the cloth she had left, ran his thumb over its worn edge, then folded it again and set it back down exactly where it had been, like he understood that some things were not meant to be returned, only kept until they no longer needed to be held. Morning came quiet, not with birds or voices, but with the slow creak of wood settling and the faint pull of wind slipping through the cracks of the cabin walls. And Ethan was already awake, sitting at the edge of the small table, hat beside him, eyes on the door like he expected something to come through it. But nothing did, only light, thin and pale, stretching across the floorboards until it reached the folded cloth Clara had left. And for a moment, he just watched it, as if the sunlight might change what it meant, but it did not. And behind him, he heard movement, soft, careful, the kind of sound people make when they are not sure they are allowed to exist in a place yet. The smallest boy first, stepping down from the narrow bed, feet finding the cold wood, then the others, slower, watching everything, measuring distance, and Clara last, already awake, already composed, as if sleep was something she borrowed, not something she relied on. She did not greet him, did not ask what came next. She simply moved to the corner where a small iron stove sat, checked it, found it empty, then stepped outside without a word. And Ethan stood, followed after a moment, keeping space between them, not out of caution, but out of respect for something unspoken. Outside, the air carried that dry smell of open land, dust and distance, and Clara was already at the well, pulling the rope with steady hands, not fast, not slow, just certain. And Ethan stopped a few feet away, watching, not stepping in, not taking over, because he understood something most men did not, that help given too quickly could feel like a hand closing instead of opening. And when she lifted the bucket, she did not struggle, even with the weight. She braced, adjusted, moved with a rhythm that came from years of doing things alone. And when she turned, she saw him there, and for a second, neither spoke. Then she said, "We work, simple, direct, no question in it." And Ethan nodded once. "We do." And that was enough. No plan, no orders, just 2 people standing in the same space, agreeing without saying more. And by mid-morning, the yard began to shift, the children gathering small sticks, unsure at first, then more certain as Clara showed them where to place them, how to stack, how to make something useful from what others ignored. The girl sweeping the floor inside with a worn brush she found leaning against the wall, moving slow, careful, like she was afraid to disturb something that might break. And the middle child sat near the door, tying and untying the cloth around his wrist, then placing it on the table again, as if deciding it belonged there now. And Ethan worked the fence line, hammer tapping wood back into place, each strike measured, not loud, not forceful, just enough, and every now and then, he glanced toward the cabin, not to check, not to control, just to see. And what he saw was not what the town had promised, not chaos, not burden, but movement, quiet, steady, like a place, learning to breathe again. And near noon, Clara stepped out with a tin cup, filled it from the bucket, and set it on the edge of the table without calling him, without offering, just placing it there. And when Ethan came in, he saw it, paused, then drank, not looking at her, not needing to, because something had already been said, not in words, but in the way the cup had been set down, and the way he did not hesitate to use it. And outside, the wind shifted again, carrying faint sounds from far off, maybe riders, maybe just the land settling. But inside that small place, something had begun to take root, something the town could not measure, could not mock, because it was too quiet to see and too steady to break. By the third day, the dust carried something different, not louder, not sharper, just a presence that lingered longer in the air, like the land itself was holding its breath, and Ethan noticed it before he saw it. A faint shift beyond the ridge, the kind of movement that did not belong to wind or cattle, and he paused at the fence line, hammer resting in his hand, eyes narrowing just slightly, not alarmed, just aware. While behind him the cabin moved in its quiet rhythm, the girl sweeping again. Slower now, more confident. The smallest boy sitting on the step tracing lines in the dirt with a stick, and Clara inside, mending a tear along the sleeve of a shirt that was not hers, her hand steady, her posture unchanged, as if nothing outside that space could reach her unless she allowed it. And when the sound came, distant hoofbeats, soft but steady, none of them reacted right away, not out of ignorance, but because each of them had learned something about waiting, about not moving too soon. And Ethan set the hammer down, wiped his hands once against his pants, then walked toward the open yard, not fast, not slow, just enough to meet whatever was coming on his own ground. And the riders appeared over the rise, 4 of them, silhouettes first, then shape, then detail, hats low, coats carrying the dust of the same road that led back to town. And they did not rush, did not shout. They approached like men who believed time belonged to them. And when they stopped near the gate, they did not dismount, just looked, measuring, not the cabin, not the fence, but the space between Ethan and the door. And one of them spoke, voice even, almost casual. Heard you made yourself a decision. And Ethan did not answer right away, just rested his hand on the top rail of the fence, eyes steady, not challenging, not yielding, just there. And the man continued. Town is curious how long it lasts. A faint smile behind the words, not friendly, not cruel, just certain. And Ethan glanced, once toward the cabin, not checking, just acknowledging, then back to the rider. Long enough, he said. And that was all. No defense, no explanation, just a line placed where it needed to be. And the silence that followed stretched a little longer than before, the kind that makes men reconsider what they expected to hear. And one of the others shifted in the saddle, a small movement, but enough to show they had not come for a quick answer. And behind Ethan, the cabin door opened, slow, deliberate, and Clara stepped out, not rushing, not hiding, just stepping into the same sunlight that covered everything else, her presence changing nothing and everything at once. And the children stayed inside, watching from the shadow, not afraid, just quiet. And Clara walked to stand a few feet behind Ethan, not close enough to lean on him, not far enough to be separate, just there, aligned without effort. And she said nothing, did nothing, only stood, shoulders straight, eyes level. And the riders noticed. Of course they did, because silence like that is harder to ignore than any words. And the first man looked at her, then back at Ethan, and something in his expression shifted, not respect, not yet, but something less certain than before. People do not like change, he said after a moment, as if offering a warning wrapped in observation. And Ethan nodded once. Then they will have to get used to it. And the wind moved again, brushing across the yard, lifting a thin layer of dust between them, softening edges, blurring lines, and for a brief second, it was hard to tell who belonged where. who held what ground, and when it settled, the riders did not press further, did not argue. They simply turned their horses, slow, deliberate, as if they had seen enough for now, and rode back the way they came, leaving behind nothing but the fading rhythm of hooves and a question that hung heavier than before, and Ethan did not move until they were gone from sight, not because he feared they would return, but because he understood that some things needed to finish leaving before you stepped back inside. And when he finally turned, Clara was already moving, already returning to the cabin, not asking what it meant, not asking what would come next, because she had learned long ago that answers do not always arrive when you expect them, only that they do, eventually, and sometimes they come in the form of men who leave without taking anything at all. The days did not break them, not the fourth, not the fifth, not even the sixth when the sun pressed harder against the land and the wind carried less mercy. But something else began to press in, quieter than riders, slower than hunger, the kind of pressure that comes from being watched without being seen. And Ethan felt it in the way the road stayed empty when he walked toward town that morning, hat low, coat light, steps measured across the 2 miles of dry earth that separated his cabin from the only place that sold flour and salt. And when he reached the edge of the street, nothing stopped him, no one blocked his way, but no one greeted him either. Doors half open, voices low, eyes turning then turning away, like he had crossed into a place that had already decided he did not belong anymore. And inside the general store, the air smelled of wood and coffee grounds, the shelves lined with what little the season allowed. And the shopkeeper stood behind the counter, hands resting flat. Not busy, not welcoming, just waiting. And Ethan stepped forward, set a small stack of coins on the worn surface. Flour, he said, simple, direct, and the man looked at the coins, then at Ethan, then back at the coins again, longer this time, as if the metal itself carried something heavier than its weight. We are short, the man replied, voice steady but not true, because the sacks were there, plain to see behind him, stacked against the wall, untouched, and Ethan did not argue, did not point, did not raise his voice. He simply let his gaze rest there for a second longer than needed, then reached forward and pulled the coins back into his hand, one by one. The sound of metal against wood quiet but clear, and he turned, leaving without another word, not hurried, not slow, just gone, and outside. The street remained the same, still, watchful, like nothing had happened, but everything had, and the walk back felt longer, not because the distance had changed, but because now it carried the weight of something understood. And when he reached the cabin, the children were outside, the smallest one chasing a shadow across the dirt, laughing for the first time, a sound light enough to lift something unseen, and the girl sat near the fence, mending a tear in her sleeve with careful hands, her movements more certain now, while Clara stood near the well, drawing water again, steady as before. And when Ethan approached, he did not speak right away, just set the empty space beside the door where a sack should have been, and Clara saw it, of course she did, her eyes moving from the ground to his hands, then back again, reading what was not there instead of what was, and she nodded once, not in disappointment, not in surprise, just acknowledgement, and she turned, walked inside, returning moments later with a small cloth bundle, worn, tied tight, and she placed it on the table between them, the same place where she had set the cup days before, and when she opened it, there was flour inside, not much, but enough, the kind you save, not the kind you spend. And Ethan looked at it, then at her, and she said, we planned for worse. And there was no pride in it, no bitterness, just truth, plain and steady. And he did not thank her, because he understood that gratitude spoken too quickly can make something smaller than it is. So instead he reached out, took a portion, careful not to take more than his share, and left the rest. And outside, the wind shifted again, carrying the distant echo of something unseen, maybe voices, maybe nothing at all. But inside that small cabin, the balance held, not because the world allowed it, but because neither of them asked permission for it to exist. And somewhere beyond the ridge, the town continued to wait, not with action, not yet, but with something quieter, something that would come not as a storm, but as a slow, deliberate test of how long silence could stand before it was forced to speak. The next morning came with no wind at all, A stillness so complete it felt like the land itself was waiting to see what they would do without being pushed, and Ethan noticed it the moment he stepped outside, boots settling into the same ground that had not changed but somehow felt heavier, like every step now carried more than just weight. In the sky, stretched wide and empty above them, pale blue with no clouds to soften it, no shade to hide beneath, just open space that gave nothing and took nothing. And behind him the cabin door creaked once, soft, and the children followed him out, not rushing, not lingering, just moving as they had begun to learn, together without needing to be told, the smallest boy walking a little taller now, no longer watching the ground with every step, the girl carrying a small tin cup she had cleaned herself, holding it carefully like it mattered, because now it did, and Clara stepped out last, her hands already busy, already knowing what the day would require without asking it first, and she paused beside Ethan for a brief moment, not speaking, just standing there, eyes scanning the horizon the same way his did, not searching for danger, just acknowledging that it existed somewhere beyond sight. And then she moved, crossing the yard toward the fence where the wood still leaned uneven from seasons of neglect, and Ethan followed, picking up the hammer again, passing it to her without a word, and she took it, tested the weight once, then struck the post, not hard, not hesitant, just enough, and the sound carried across the quiet morning, steady, deliberate, a rhythm that did not ask permission from the silence around it. And the children watched it first, then joined, the middle child bringing nails one by one, placing them in Clara's open palm without being told, the smallest boy, gathering small stones to press along the base of the fence, making it stronger in ways no one had shown him, but he somehow understood, and Ethan worked alongside them, not leading, not correcting, just adding what he knew where it was needed. And for a while, that was all there was: wood, dust, breath, movement, the kind of work that does not announce itself but leaves something behind when it is done. And by midday, the fence stood straighter, not perfect, but enough to hold, enough to mark a line that had not been there before. And Clara stepped back, wiped her hands on her skirt, and looked at it without satisfaction, without doubt, just recognition, and Ethan nodded once, the smallest acknowledgement. But it carried weight, because it was given, not expected, and then from the distance, not loud but clear in the still air, came a different sound, not hooves this time, not riders, but something lighter, wheels turning slow over dry ground, and all of them heard it, all of them paused, not out of fear, but because they had learned that what approached rarely came empty, and Ethan turned toward the road, eyes narrowing just enough to focus. And over the ridge appeared a wagon, old, worn, moving, steady, pulled by a tired horse that did not rush because it did not need to, and the figure guiding it kept their head low, not hiding, just conserving what little energy the day allowed. And Clara stood beside Ethan again, not stepping back, not stepping forward, just there, aligned in the same quiet line they had begun to form, and the children gathered closer, not clinging, just aware, and as the wagon drew nearer, the details came into view, the creak of wood, the slow turn of wheels, the dust rising in soft clouds behind it. And whoever was coming was not from the town, not from the same place that had turned its back. This was something else, something slower, something that carried its own weight without asking the land to bear it. And Ethan did not move to meet it, did not call out. He simply stood his ground, watching, waiting, because he understood something simple now, that not everything arriving was meant to test them, and not everything leaving had taken something away. And as the wagon rolled closer, the space between what they had built and what was coming began to narrow, not with tension, but with possibility, quiet, uncertain, but real enough to be felt in the stillness that no longer belonged to the land alone. The wagon did not stop right away, and that was the first thing Ethan noticed, not the horse, not the driver, but the way it kept rolling a few yards past the gate before slowing down, like whoever held the reins understood something about distance, about not stepping into another man's ground too quickly, and the wheels creaked softer as they came to rest, dust settling in a thin cloud that hung in the still air before drifting away, and the figure on the seat remained there for a moment, head slightly bowed, hands resting loose on the reins, not hiding, not revealing, just waiting, and Ethan did not move either, not yet, his weight steady, one hand resting lightly on the fence post he had just helped straighten, feeling the grain of the wood under his palm as if grounding himself in something that had already been claimed. And beside him Clara stood the same as before, shoulders square, eyes forward, not curious, not afraid, simply present. And behind them the children gathered closer without being told, not clinging, just aware, learning the shape of moments like this by standing inside them. And after a few seconds that stretched longer than they should have, the driver finally moved, lifting his head, pushing his hat back just enough to show a face lined more by years than hardship, eyes steady but not sharp, the kind of eyes that had seen enough to stop asking certain questions. And he climbed down slow, boots hitting the ground with a soft thud that carried across the yard. And he did not step forward right away, just stood there, letting the space settle again. Then he spoke, voice low, even. Name is Walter Green. And Ethan gave a small nod. Nothing more. Ethan Cole. And that was enough. Names placed, not offered for approval, just acknowledged. And Walter glanced toward the cabin, then back to Ethan, his gaze passing briefly over Clara and the children, not lingering, not judging, just seeing them as part of what stood there. And he said, "Been riding a long way." Simple words, but they carried more than distance. And Ethan nodded again. "You found a place to stop." And Walter let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh if it had been louder. "Looks like that," he said. And for a moment, none of them moved, the kind of pause that holds more than words ever could, until Walter turned back to the wagon, reaching behind him, pulling aside a worn canvas cover that had kept whatever was inside hidden from the sun. And when he lifted it, the smell came first, faint but unmistakable, grain, dried meat, supplies that did not come easy this far out. And Clara's eyes shifted, just slightly, not wide, not hopeful, just aware. And the children leaned forward a fraction, drawn by something they had not seen in days. And Walter reached in, pulling out a small sack, not large, not heavy, but enough. And he held it for a second before stepping closer, stopping a few feet from the fence, not crossing it, not offering it too quickly. And he said, "Heard a man in town turned away with empty hands." And Ethan's jaw tightened just enough to show he understood what that meant. But he did not answer, did not confirm, because some things did not need repeating. And Walter nodded once, like that silence told him everything he needed. And he set the sack on the top rail of the fence, not pushing it forward, just leaving it there between them. And for a moment, no one reached for it. Not Ethan, not Clara, because they both understood that what was given too easily sometimes carried something else with it. And Walter rested his hand lightly on the wood, not claiming, not insisting, just waiting. And he said, "Not charity, quiet, firm, just passing through. And I do not like seeing good ground go to waste." And Ethan looked at him then, really looked, not at the wagon, not at the supplies, but at the man, measuring something that could not be seen in what he carried. And after a second, he reached out, placed his hand on the sack, feeling its weight, its reality, then lifted it, slow, deliberate, not as a man taking, but as a man accepting something that had been placed without demand. And he gave a small nod. "Then it will not." And that was all. No thanks, no debt spoken, just a line drawn between what was given and what was kept. And Walter stepped back, satisfied in a way that did not show on his face but settled in his stance. And he turned toward his wagon again, not lingering, not asking for more, because he understood something too, that some places are not built by what arrives, but by what stays. And as he climbed back onto the seat, gathering the reins, Clara stepped forward just enough to place a tin cup on the fence where the sack had been, filled with water drawn from their well, not as repayment, not as obligation, just balance. And Walter paused, looked at it, then at her, and gave a small nod before taking it, drinking slow, like a man who respected what was offered without needing to speak it. And when he handed the cup back, the moment closed without needing anything else, and the wagon began to move again, wheels turning, dust rising, carrying him back toward the horizon. And this time, the stillness that followed did not feel empty. It felt held, like something unseen had shifted just enough to make room for what they were building. And Ethan stood there a moment longer, the sack in his hands, the weight of it steady, real, before turning back toward the cabin where Clara and the children already waited, not for him, but for what came next. That evening settled slower than the others, the kind of dusk that did not rush the sun away, but let it linger just above the horizon, stretching long shadows across the yard, turning the dust into something softer, almost golden, and inside the cabin the air carried a different weight, not heavy, not tense, just full, like something had shifted without asking permission, and Clara stood at the table, opening the sack Walter had left, her hands moving careful, deliberate, measuring without tools, just memory and instinct guiding what was needed and what could wait, and the children gathered close, not crowding, not reaching, just watching, learning how something small could become enough when handled the right way, and Ethan stood near the door, one shoulder resting lightly against the frame, not removed, not involved, just present, observing the quiet rhythm that had begun to take shape in his home, a rhythm he had not built but had allowed, and the smallest boy leaned forward, eyes fixed on the flour as Clara poured a portion into a tin bowl, the fine dust catching the last light of the day, rising just enough to glow before settling again. And Clara added water, not much, just enough, her fingers working the mixture slowly, pressing, folding, shaping, not hurried, not careful, just certain, and the girl stepped closer, offering a piece of cloth, and Clara took it without looking, wiped her hands once, then passed a small portion of the dough to the girl, not instructing, just trusting, and the girl mirrored her movements, slower, less sure, but trying, and Ethan watched that, not the food, not the process, but the way it was given, the way it was received, and something in his posture shifted, not visible, not spoken, just there, like a man realizing he had stepped into something that did not need him to lead it, only to hold the space for it to exist, and outside. The wind returned, softer now, brushing against the walls with a low whisper, not pressing, not testing, just passing through, and the sound of it mixed with the quiet movements inside, the scrape of wood, the soft press of hands against dough, the faint breath of children who no longer held it in, and when the first flat piece was placed on the heated iron, the smell rose slow and warm, filling the small space with something that did not belong to hunger, but to home, and the smallest boy smiled without meaning to. A quick, quiet thing that passed across his face like light through a window, and Clara saw it, did not react, did not speak, but her hands slowed for just a moment before continuing, and when the bread was ready, she broke it, not evenly, not carefully, just enough to share, placing pieces into each small hand, then one for Ethan, setting it on the table without offering, just leaving it where it could be taken, and he stepped forward, picked it up, paused for a second as if measuring something unseen, then took a bite, slow, deliberate, and nodded once, not to her, not to anyone, just to the moment itself, and outside, the last light slipped away, leaving the land in that quiet blue that comes before full dark, and somewhere beyond the ridge, the town still held its distance, still waited for something to break, but inside that cabin, nothing broke, nothing bent, it simply continued, steady, quiet, like something that had found its place without asking for one. And as the night settled fully, the children lay down. Without fear, without watching the door, without holding their breath, and Clara remained at the table a moment longer, hands resting still, eyes lowered not in thought but in presence, and Ethan stepped outside. Once more, looking out across the open land, the stars beginning to show one by one, and he stood there in the silence, not alone, not anymore, holding nothing, needing nothing, just staying where he had chosen to stand. The night did not pass in silence, not entirely, because silence out here was never empty. It carried weight, small sounds that told stories to those who knew how to listen, the slow creak of wood adjusting to cooler air, the distant call of something moving across open land, the faint rustle of wind brushing against dry grass, and Ethan stood just outside the cabin long after the others had settled, not watching for danger, not guarding, just standing in a place that no longer felt like it belonged to only one man. And when he finally stepped back inside, the room held a different kind of quiet, one that came from people sleeping without fear, the children resting close, not clinging, just near, their breathing even, their bodies no longer tight with the habit of waiting. And Clara sat at the table, not working, not moving, just there, hands folded loosely in front of her, eyes lowered but not closed, as if she was listening to something inside the stillness that did not need words, and Ethan paused at the doorway, not interrupting, not announcing himself. And after a moment she spoke, her voice low, steady. They will come again. And he did not ask who, did not need to, because both of them understood that the town did not forget, it only waited. And he nodded once, stepping further in, resting his hand lightly on the back of the chair across from her. Then we will be here, he said. And that was all. No plan, no defense, just a statement placed where it needed to be. And Clara looked up then, not searching, not questioning, just seeing. And for a second something passed between them, not agreement, not gratitude, something quieter, something that did not need to be named to exist. And she stood, moving to check on the children, adjusting a blanket without waking them, her movements gentle but not fragile, the kind of care that comes from repetition, from doing the same thing long enough that it becomes part of who you are. And Ethan watched that, not the act itself, but the steadiness behind it, the way she did not hesitate, did not doubt. And when she returned to the table, she picked up the small folded cloth again, the one she had placed there days before, and she turned it once in her hands, then set it down in front of him, not pushing it forward, just placing it there. You kept it, she said, not as a question, and Ethan glanced at it, then back at her. Some things are not meant to be returned, he replied, and she held his gaze for a moment longer than before, not measuring, not testing, just accepting what had already been decided without saying it. And outside, the wind shifted again, carrying with it a faint sound from far off, too distant to name, but enough to remind them that the world beyond their walls had not changed, had not softened, and would not for them, not for anyone. And yet inside that small cabin, something had settled deeper, something that did not depend on what waited outside. And the hours moved slow, unmarked by anything but the passing of darkness, until the first hint of light touched the edge of the window, pale and quiet. And with it came a different kind of sound, not wind, not distance, but something closer, something deliberate. And Ethan heard it first, not because it was loud, but because he had learned to listen for what did not belong. And he turned toward the door, not rushing, not reacting, just aware. And Clara stood as well, already there before he spoke, already understanding without needing to ask. And the children stirred behind them, not waking fully, but shifting, as if they too felt the change in the air. And the sound came again, closer now, the slow, steady approach of something that did not hide its presence. And Ethan stepped toward the door, hand resting lightly against the wood, pausing for a brief moment before opening it, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the line between what was inside and what waited beyond. And when the door moved, the morning light spilled in, carrying with it the shape of what had come, and whatever it was, it had not come by accident. The light came in thin and pale through the doorway, stretching across the floorboards like it was careful not to disturb anything inside. And Ethan stood there with his hand still resting on the door, eyes fixed on what waited beyond, not surprised, not unprepared, just present in the moment as it arrived. And a man stood at the edge of the yard, not mounted, not moving, just standing with his hat in his hands like he had already decided how this would go before he ever stepped onto the land. And for a second, nothing was said, the kind of silence that holds weight without needing to be filled. And then the man lifted his head slightly, not enough to challenge, just enough to be seen. Sheriff Brennan, he said, voice even, carrying just far enough to reach the door. And Ethan gave a small nod, stepping forward one pace into the morning light. You found your way out here early, he replied, and the sheriff glanced once at the rising sun, then back at him. Some things do not wait. And that was enough to say what needed saying without pressing it further. And behind Ethan, Clara had already moved closer, not standing beside him, not behind him, just within reach of the same moment. And the children watched from inside, quiet, aware, not afraid, just still. And the sheriff took a step forward, stopping just short of the fence, not crossing it, not claiming the ground. And he looked at the place, the repaired fence, the swept yard, the small signs of something holding together where it had not before. And something in his expression shifted, not judgment, not approval, just recognition. And he spoke again, slower this time. Town has been talking. And Ethan did not answer, did not need to, because talk did not change what stood in front of him, and the sheriff continued. They say you have taken on more than a man should. And Ethan's gaze did not move. They say a lot of things, he said, quiet, steady, and the sheriff let out a breath. Not quite a sigh, not quite relief, just something in between, and he reached into his coat, pulling out a folded piece of paper, holding it for a moment before speaking again. There is concern, he said, choosing the word carefully, about stability, and he extended the paper toward the fence, not offering it directly, just placing it where it could be taken, and Ethan stepped forward, took it without hesitation, unfolded it slow, eyes moving across the lines, not rushing, not reacting, just reading, and the words were simple, official, the kind that carried weight because of who had written them, not because of what they said, questioning ownership, questioning suitability, questioning whether a place like this could hold what it now held. And when Ethan finished, he folded it again, just as carefully, and set it on the top rail of the fence, not returning it, not accepting it, just placing it there between them. And he said, "This land has not changed." And the sheriff watched him, waiting, and Ethan continued, "Only the people standing on it." And the sheriff's eyes shifted then, not to Ethan, but past him, toward Clara, who stood without moving, without lowering her gaze, and for a moment, the morning held all three of them in the same line, not divided, not aligned, just present in the same space. And the sheriff nodded once, slow, thoughtful, and he said, "That is what concerns them." And the wind stirred again, light but steady, moving through the yard, lifting dust just enough to blur the edges of everything. And for a second, the lines between what belonged and what did not seemed less certain, and then the sheriff stepped back, not turning yet, just giving the moment room to settle, and he said, "I came to see it myself." And Ethan met his gaze, not challenging, not yielding, just there. "Now you have," he replied, and the sheriff held that for a second longer, then gave a small nod, like a man closing a thought he had not yet spoken, and he turned, walking back the way he had come, not rushing, not lingering, just leaving the same way he arrived, and the paper remained on the fence between them, unmoved, untouched, carrying its quiet weight in the morning light. And Ethan did not pick it up, did not follow, he simply stood there, for a moment longer, then turned back toward the cabin, where Clara and the children waited, not for answers, but for what would come next, and behind him, the wind lifted once more, brushing against the paper until it shifted slightly on the wood, not falling, not flying away, just moving enough to remind him that some things stay until they are no longer needed. The paper stayed where it was through the rest of the morning, resting on the fence rail like it had found its place there, not blowing away, not demanding attention, just waiting, and Ethan did not touch it, not when he walked past it to check the well, not when he moved along the fence line, not even when the children drifted close enough to see it, their eyes curious but their hands still, because they had already learned something about what belonged to them and what did not, and Clara saw it too. Of course she did, but she gave it no more weight than she gave the wind or the dust, because she understood that some things only hold power when you reach for them. And by midday, the sun had risen high enough to press its heat down across the land, flattening shadows, sharpening edges, and the work continued the way it had begun, steady, quiet, without announcement, and Ethan moved through it like a man who had already chosen his ground, not defending it, not proving it, just standing in it. And the children followed that rhythm without needing to be told, the girl tending to the small space near the cabin door, brushing away dust that would return by evening, but cleaning it anyway, because it mattered in the moment, the middle child stacking small pieces of wood into something that might become useful later, and the smallest boy carrying water in the tin cup back and forth between the well and the table, spilling some each time, but never stopping, never giving up the task. And Clara moved between them all, not directing, not correcting, just adjusting what needed to be adjusted, placing her hand lightly where it mattered, then letting go. And sometime in the afternoon, when the heat began to ease just enough for the air to move again, Ethan stepped toward the fence and finally reached for the paper, not quickly, not with purpose, just because it was time, and he lifted it, unfolded it once more, eyes scanning the same lines that had not changed, and for a moment, he held it there, not reading, not thinking, just letting it exist in his hands. and then he folded it again, slower this time. And instead of placing it back on the fence, he walked toward the small fire pit beside the cabin, where the coals from the morning still held a faint glow beneath the ash, and he knelt, brushing the surface once, revealing the quiet heat beneath, and without hesitation, he placed the paper there, not as a gesture, not as defiance, just as something that no longer needed to be kept, and the edges darkened first, curling inward, the ink fading before the flame even touched it, and he watched it for a second longer than necessary, then stood, turning away before it was fully gone, because some endings do not need to be witnessed to be complete, and Clara saw it from where she stood, her hand still for just a moment before she returned to what she was doing. No comment, no acknowledgement, just continuation, because she understood that what mattered had already been decided before the paper ever arrived, and the children noticed too, in their own way, not the act itself, but the absence of something that had once been there. And the smallest boy stepped closer to the fire pit after Ethan moved away, watching the last of the paper turn to ash, and he crouched down, reaching out with a small stick, stirring it once, then twice, until it was nothing more than gray dust that lifted into the air and disappeared, and he stood again, looking back toward the cabin, then toward Ethan. And for the first time, there was no question in his eyes, no uncertainty, just a quiet understanding that something had been settled. And as the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows once more across the yard, the land seemed to breathe easier, not because anything had changed beyond it, but because within that small space, something had held, something had not bent, and Ethan stood at the edge of it, watching the horizon as he had done so many times before, but now there was no waiting in it, no expectation, just presence, steady and certain, like a man who had stopped measuring time by what might come next and started living in what was already here. The next few days passed without interruption, not because the world beyond their land had softened, but because it had shifted its attention somewhere else, or perhaps it was simply waiting for something that never came. And in that quiet space, what they had begun continued to take shape, not in large ways, not in anything that would draw notice from a distance, but in the small things that held more weight than most ever saw. And each morning arrived with the same pale light slipping through the window, touching the table, the worn boards, the folded cloth that no longer needed to be moved. And Clara was always the first to rise, not out of urgency, not out of habit alone, but because she understood that the day did not begin with the sun, it began with the decision to meet it. And she moved through the cabin with that same steady rhythm, checking what needed checking, adjusting what needed adjusting, never rushing, never hesitating. And the children followed her lead without being told, the girl now waking before the others, stepping outside to sweep the small stretch of ground near the door, not because it would stay clean, but because it mattered that it was, even for a moment. And the middle child had begun to gather wood before being asked, stacking it near the wall in a way that made sense only after you saw it finished. And the smallest boy no longer spilled water when he carried it, his steps more certain, his hands steadier, as if the ground beneath him had finally decided to hold him, instead of testing him. And Ethan moved among them all, not directing, not correcting, just present in the work, adding where it was needed, stepping back where it was not. And in that balance, something had formed that did not need to be named, because it showed itself in every small action, every quiet choice. And by the end of the week, the place no longer looked like something that had been left behind. It looked like something claimed, not through words or declarations, but through the simple act of staying. And one afternoon, as the light began to soften again, Clara stepped inside and reached beneath the table, pulling out a small wooden box, worn at the edges, the kind of thing that had traveled farther than it appeared, and she placed it on the table without ceremony, opening it with the same steady hand she used for everything else. And inside were a few folded papers, older than the one that had burned, thicker, marked with lines and ink that had not faded, and Ethan watched as she unfolded one of them, smoothing it flat against the wood. And for a moment, neither spoke, the children drifting closer, drawn by something they could not yet understand. And Clara rested her hand on the paper, not claiming it, just anchoring it. And she said, "This land was never empty," her voice low, even, not explaining, just stating what was. And Ethan looked down at the markings, at the lines that traced boundaries not by fences, but by agreement, by time, by something that could not be taken simply because someone decided it should be. And he did not ask where it came from, did not ask why it had not been shown before, because he understood that some things are revealed only when they are no longer needed to prove anything. And Clara continued, "They will come again, not to ask, but to take." And she lifted her hand from the paper, letting it rest there between them. "But they will not find what they think they will." And Ethan nodded once, not because he fully understood every line drawn in ink, but because he understood the weight behind them, the truth that did not depend on paper to exist. And outside, the wind moved across the land again, carrying with it the faint echo of something distant, something that might have been the town remembering what it had tried to forget. And inside that small cabin, the moment settled, not with tension, not with fear, but with a quiet certainty, because what stood there was no longer just a man, a woman, and 3 children. It was something held together by choice, by presence, by the simple refusal to step away. And that was something no paper, no voice, no distant judgment could easily undo. The morning they came back, the land did not warn them. No wind shifted, no dust rose ahead of time. Just the same pale light stretching across the yard, touching the fence, the well, the small marks of work that had turned something forgotten into something lived in. And Ethan stood near the edge of it, not waiting, not expecting, just there, as he had been every day since he chose not to leave. And Clara stepped out beside him. The papers no longer on the table, no longer needed in sight, because what they held had already taken root in something stronger than ink. And the children stood behind them, not hiding, not holding back, just present in the space that had slowly become theirs without asking anyone for permission. And when the riders appeared over the ridge, they did not come fast, did not come loud, just steady, measured, like men who believed they had time on their side. And there were more of them this time, not a crowd, not an army, just enough to remind anyone watching that they were not alone in what they carried. And they stopped at the same distance as before, just beyond the fence, not crossing, not stepping in, because even they understood that some lines were not drawn in wood. And the first man removed his hat this time, not out of respect, not entirely, but because something in the place had shifted since he last saw it. And he looked not at Ethan first, but at Clara, then at the children, then at the cabin itself, as if measuring something that had not been there before. And he said, "We came to settle this." His voice even, not raised, not softened, just placed where it could be heard. And Ethan did not move, did not step forward. He simply rested his hand once more on the fence, the same place it had been when this all began. And Clara stood beside him, not behind, not ahead, just aligned, her presence unchanged, her posture steady. And the children did not step back this time, did not shrink. They remained where they were, quiet but certain. And for a moment, nothing happened, the kind of pause that decides things before they are spoken. And then the man continued, "This land, these claims, they do not hold the way you think they do." And Clara's gaze did not shift, did not waver. She simply reached back toward the cabin door without turning, her hand finding the edge of the frame, grounding herself not in argument, but in something already built. And she said, "They hold exactly as they are meant to." And her voice did not rise, did not push. It settled into the space like something that had always been there, waiting to be heard. And the man looked at her for a long second, longer than he had looked at anything else since arriving. And something in his expression changed, not defeat, not agreement, just recognition of something he had not expected to face. And Ethan said nothing, did nothing, because he understood that this moment did not belong to him, not entirely. It belonged to the ground beneath them, to the choice that had been made without words. The day he stepped forward and did not step back, and the wind moved again, light but steady, brushing across the yard, lifting dust just enough to blur the edges between them. And for a second, no one spoke, no one moved. And then the man replaced his hat, slow, deliberate, and he gave a small nod, not to Ethan, not even to Clara, but to the space itself, as if acknowledging something that could not be taken without breaking more than he was willing to break. And he turned, signaling the others without words, and one by one, they followed, their horses shifting, their presence pulling back the way it had come, not chased, not driven, just gone. and the silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt complete, like something had closed without needing to be forced, and Ethan stood there for a moment longer, then let his hand fall from the fence, turning back toward the cabin, where Clara and the children already moved, not celebrating, not reacting, just continuing, because for them, nothing had ended, nothing had begun, it had simply held, and as the sun climbed higher, casting its light across the land that no longer felt uncertain, the smallest boy stepped forward, looking up at Ethan, and said one word, quiet, certain, "Pa." And Ethan did not answer right away. He just looked down at the child, then toward Clara, then back again, and he nodded. Once, slow, deliberate, like a man accepting something that had already been true long before it was spoken, and out there, beyond the ridge, the town would talk again, would wonder, would try to understand what had happened without a fight, without a claim, without anything they recognized as power. But here, in this small piece of land marked by nothing more than presence and choice, it was already understood, because out here, justice did not need to be spoken, it just needed someone willing to stay.